What's up, Red Blood Black Flag? I haven't made a video in a long time. It's been quite a while, I think, since the last one. But this one's going to be about the general kind of belief and concept of might makes right. And I'm going to use a conversation I've been having on Facebook with a person who takes it as a given, right? So, and a lot of people do this. I mean, most statists probably would articulate this in some way or another. I'm not sure like which camp it might be more predominant in, but I've come across it for a while. You know, running the whole spectrum here. So I'm scrolling up through here to see where he laid his basic position out. Like a couple days ago, he had basically said that might makes right. So, okay, so here we go. So, like I said, justice. So we're talking about justice, which this might sound incorrect, but it's, I mean, I would say it's pretty correct. I mean, justice, right, moral, these are all essentially talking about the same thing. Basically, they're all kind of, they're ethical terms, right? They're ethical terms, which moral terms are ethical terms. So it's all kind of the same thing. Justice, rights, you know, these we're generally talking about the same fundamental concept, which, I mean, you could call justice, basically, is what I would call it. Justice, I guess, is kind of the overarching umbrella term. And then in order to find what justice is, or to articulate what we view justice as, we use ethics and other things that revolve around the concept of justice. So basically, the standard belief is that, well, the actual standard belief is basically whatever the government says is law is justified because government is perceived to be authority, and that means that they have the right to rule. And so ultimately the statist is hallucinating that morality or justice alters with what the law is, and this individual says as much in conversation. So I'm still going through, and I'm almost there, but he says, so, okay, so here it is. He says, okay, so I said, if it started off with him talking about libertarianism or anarchism or anarcho-capitalism or voluntarism or whatever as basically being immoral, because he says that it's, a person says I'm starving and a guy says I choose to not voluntarily aid you. And as cold as this sounds, my reply to that initially was, so in your righteous benevolence you think other people should be forced to feed him. Also, you think that you should be forced to feed him, because that's the argument. The argument isn't over, should we let poor people starve? Like, obviously, no, I don't think that that's a good thing to do. I think that's pretty scummy. But ultimately, as cold as it is, you know, I said, you do not have to sacrifice that which is yours if you don't want to. To say otherwise is to say you are a slave, which is exactly what it is. So, I mean, really, you only have two choices. I mean, well, there's three, I guess. You can not help the poor. And I don't think that that necessarily makes you a bad person, though I would probably question an association with you if, like, there's literally a guy who's clearly starving, and you know, I mean, and you have money and he's begging you, and I mean, he's literally starving, and you don't give him anything, you don't try to help. I mean, I would try to help, but I'm not going to think that violence should be done against you if you don't. I probably just wouldn't associate with you much, you know, because it's like, wow, you have like no compassion or pity whatsoever. Like, this guy's clearly, you know, if he's disabled or something, you just have no, it's obvious, well, it's not maybe obvious, but, you know, there's extremes and stuff to where, you know, and everybody does that. Everybody judges, you know, if a rich guy is a completely destitute person who really is there through no fault of their own, and they have no compassion for them whatsoever, I mean, that's one thing, right? You have no compassion. But we're not saying that poor people should be left to starve. We just think that people should not be forced to help the poor people. And people might think that we're naive, but I think that it shines through in reality in the market that people do help others absent coercion. You know, their argument is just that it's not enough. And yeah, it's probably not enough because the state works to keep us poor through all types of taxes, regulations, and inflation and things. But so that's how the argument started, is that I choose not to voluntarily aid you. And I said, so in your benevolence you think others should be forced. And he says, I think those who refuse to aid them use excuses like anarchy as justification. And my reply to that is they are justified. You don't have to sacrifice that which is yours if you don't want to. Now, it might be kind of uncouth and it might be looked down upon, and even by me, depending on the situation, but that doesn't mean that he's not justified in not giving away what is his. That's his to give away. And if you are forced to sacrifice what is rightfully yours, then you're a slave. That's basically the same thing as saying you're a slave. Because you don't actually own that which is said to be yours. And now I just accidentally clicked the thing, and so now I got to go back. Okay, so going back, that's how it all started, and then it rolled into a lot of different things. And so, geez, sorry about that. I clicked this. Okay, so I said, like I said, you don't have to sacrifice what is yours. I said they are justified. He said depends on the society. And so I said society changes what you think is justified, question mark. His reply, different things are justified depending on the culture of the society. And I said, so slavery is justified if society thinks it is. I asked that question. I put a question mark at the end of it. A little, maybe backwards there. I write it as a statement, but then put a question mark. It's probably bad on my part. But he says it's not slavery if you can leave it, which of course applies to, love it or leave it, or you're allowed to, if you don't like it, get out and stuff. And I mean, that's irrelevant though. I said, okay, but you're saying slavery is justified if society thinks it is, question mark. Absolutely. That's why it existed in the first place, is his response. That's also why it ended. And so here is really where this is the first part where it really shows how schizophrenic this belief is, because he just doesn't know what the word justified means or implies, right? So if slavery is justified while it exists, then fighting to stop it is doing something that is unjust, right? Going against that which is justified is an injustice. That's the basic rundown of what these words and concepts mean. It can't be both at the same time, That's the law of the excluded middle, which is that either the proposition is true or its negation is true. It's the third law of logic, basically. One of the three main principles here. Either the proposition is true or its negation is true, right? It can't be both at the same time. It's one or the other. And so here the assertion is that slavery is justified if society thinks it is. And that's true or false, right? It can't be both. But it's like saying, his position is basically kind of saying that it's both, in the sense that, and he's saying that you should do what's unjust. And that makes no sense. But the part that makes no sense is he's saying slavery is just because it has been implemented. Basically, the question again, you're saying, is slavery justified if society thinks it is? Of course, society is a floating abstraction, but I'm sure he's using government as the so-called representative in his mind. So, and we do get into that. We get into, does law alter morality, which is a little bit more specific in a sense, because now we're definitely talking about the state, right? And then so I said, so justice basically has no meaning at all to you then, other than what society thinks is okay. And he said, sure it does. It's dependent on culture, which is, like I said, to you, justice equals whatever society thinks is okay. And he says, considering that's the entire point of justice, duh. And to me, I mean, no, that's not the point of justice, though I can see why he would think that. I mean, that with the way that the belief in government works and everything with the belief that authority and that legislation alters morality, it makes perfect sense that he'd be there. And I said, considering that's the point of justice, sure. I said, sure, if your morals changed based on what everyone else thinks. And here I got to say again, remember that morality, justice, and, righteousness, rightfulness, all of this, it's all basically the same concept. Like your morals are basically what, however way you want to look at it, either morality and justice, or first justice and morality, your morals are basically what you consider justice, right? Like you're not, like you might think that something is immoral. Like at what point would you think that something is immoral but also justified? I guess maybe the only example I could think of that comes close is, like I said earlier, where sure, it's justified if you keep all your money to yourself, but I mean, have you no compassion for a guy who's really destitute and down on his luck that you can't even spare a little bit for him? I mean, it's your right not to do so, but I looked at that as being a little distasteful, obviously, because I do think that people should try to help each other and whatnot, but I don't think that that view should be forced on others. So, in a sense, it's technically moral. It's technically not immoral that he did not share his wealth, and therefore it's also justified. It's justified that he keeps what is his. To say otherwise is to say slavery is justified, because it's to say that forcing someone to sacrifice for another is justified, and that's slavery. You don't have the right to force people to give up what's rightfully theirs, no matter what moral high ground you think you're claiming or how emotional it gets you worked up or whatever, So, and I said, sure, if your morals change based on what everyone else thinks, which is basically the belief here, right? Because he says that, society, justice equals whatever society says it is, basically, which is more or less might makes right. It's not exactly kind of articulated the same way, but I would imagine, based on my debates in this, I didn't really go into that because I took it as a given, which I think worked because the conversation kept flowing. He never corrected my wording, about this. What I'm saying basically is that, in his mind, in the statist's mind, law is basically the representation of power and might. And so therefore, whatever is the law is power and might. And because might makes right, the law is essentially right. So I said, how can that even lead to justice? So if there's, and this is the question that I ask to anybody who believes this, if there is a, quote, society today that thinks slavery is justified, or in any time period, it doesn't matter, but allegedly our society, in quotes, or another society does not, you're saying that slavery is both just and unjust at the same time. And I say, which society do you consider to be just? Both of them? How is that possible? And because, according to this belief, yes, both of them would have to be justified. Because whatever a, quote, society deems as justified, according to this position, is so. And so, how do you judge how do you judge, at that point, how do you judge which one is justified? And now remember, well, I didn't say this before, but, all of these are essentially ethical arguments, and we're dealing in shoulds. Right, we can deal in what is real and whatnot and that, and I believe that rights are pretty real. I mean, I understand the basically the nihilist argument and the position of that rights are, quote, subjective, and I don't think a consistent moral view is, quote, subjective, in that the actual principles don't apply based on your beliefs, because that makes no sense. Now you have no ethical grounds. You're just saying whatever is, it is, and it's all justified because it is, which is basically what this position is. And that makes no sense. And then I say that, I mean, according to he says your morals don't have to change. I say, yes, according to your position, your morals do have to change according to whatever society says, keeping in mind here that essentially justice and morality are inextricably linked. And if you don't do that, you're basically wicked and not just, because you are not abiding and going along with what the society has said, and because you think, so you say whatever society says is just is so. If you don't abide by that and change your morals and what your view of justice is and how you behave, then you are not just. You are committing injustices, because you have said whatever society says is just, and just deals in should and things like that. So basically what that word implies, justice and rights and things, is that you should obey this. If you don't obey this, you are committing an injustice, and injustice is inherently, obviously, a negative word. So you are saying you are doing basically what is wrong and what is unjust if you do not go with what is just, and you have said that what is just is whatever society says. So basically, at any point, if you disobey whatever society says, you are inherently doing that which is unjust based by this position, which is, I mean, it's really convenient for people who want to control your mind and your body, basically, but it makes absolutely no sense. So, that was my reply to his, your morals don't have to change. And it's like, well, yeah, sure, I guess you say your morals don't have to change, but now you're doing that which is unjust according to your own belief. And then he says, no, you always have the option to leave that society. And I said, that's irrelevant. And he said, no, it's not. And it is, because if society says you can leave, says you can't leave, rather, then it is just. If you leave, then you are unjust. That's the point of the argument here. It's not, you can always have the option to leave that society. That's a surface level statement. That's not anything to do with the fundamental conversation that we're having here, which is, does society and or law and or government alter what is justice, what justice is, that's the fundamental argument. So the point, like I said, is if society says that you can't leave, then according to you, then that is justice. And then here's really the key though, and it really shows that underneath it all, underneath this nonsense propaganda, everyone kind of is still an anarchist to a point. They still understand the main point, because now his reply is, one society cannot, this is his standard for judging whether or not the two societies who have differing views on slavery, which one is just. One society cannot impose its own laws on another. So no. So, that directly contradicts the actual statement that he made, though. Well, because he can't help it, because the view is schizophrenic, right? So he has, underneath this nonsense that whatever society says is just, underneath it, he has the inkling of the true form of justice, and that is cannot impose on another, right? Society is irrelevant, law is irrelevant, impose on another is the sound, logical basis, sane basis for freedom, for justice, rather. And because to say otherwise, if that's not the sound basis, and if at any point you say that that is not at all having to do with justice, then you are saying that it's not being against slavery that constitutes what justice is. I mean, that is what justice should be held by people, I would say, and I think that's the only position that makes sense. Justice can only be tied to that which is liberty and freedom, because that is how we achieve a free and just society. No one can or should impose on another who has not done so previously, right? And that what that means is that you don't have the right to murder people, because now you're imposing on another unwarranted, but everyone has the right to self-defense, because the murderer is the one who imposes first, right? He's actually the one who imposes on people. Stopping him is justified because he is the original one who has violated justice, liberty, freedom, anti-slavery, that he's the one who is working on the basis that he has the right to rule. He might not think of it that far ahead or that depthly, but he's the one acting as though he has the right to rule another person. He's the one violating liberty and justice. So, and then he says, okay, so, I mean, and that's the basic thing, I mean, I know I'm all over the place now. I'm on like 40 ounces of coffee and cigarettes and stuff, and I haven't made a video in a long time, but that's the basic thing. So let me scroll up a little bit here again to see if I pause this. Okay, so going back or continuing on this whole one slavery, the example is one society has declared slavery as just, another society who exists at the same time, like, miles away or something like that, or even next door, thinks that one thinks it's justified, one thinks slavery is unjust. Both societies have made it law or whatever, however you want to view this representation of the so-called of justice through society creation. He said one society cannot impose its laws on another, which now as I articulate this again, that's really irrelevant, because I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, is slavery justified, and how can slavery be justified because a society says it so, and how do you judge which society is justified when both of them have declared the oppositional views to be just, and both have worked to use their might to implement them? So which one is actually just? When you have a contradiction there, you have no way, because both of them have successfully implemented their policies. But then he's saying, so basically his view would have to be, and is, that that slavery is both just and unjust at the same time in different areas, based on what the so-called society has said. But he's saying one society cannot impose its laws on another. And here's the insane thing, is that really what that says is that the society that believes slavery is unjust has no right to go and stop the other society from having slaves. So basically he's saying what the United States government did in World War II is unjustified, because Nazi Germany, since that was the law and society has said that putting Jews in camps and whatnot was the law and was justified, it was justified. So one society can't impose on the other. It makes sense if you say that the society who believes in slavery has no right to force the other one to adopt slavery or to enslave them. But the point is that slavery is the basis for justice, and being against slavery is the basis for justice. That is where, liberty essentially is the basis of justice, that's the same thing, basically. Liberty is, at the most basic definition, anti-slavery, because slavery is the coercion of your life and your will. So then I say, but then here's where he gets all over the place too, and he contradicts himself, because he says one society cannot impose its laws on another, so no. And then I say, what if that society said it could? Then it would be just. You can't say that it's not just, because you have said that whatever a society says is just is so. And so in their mind, which is where the only place that it would be, is in their mind it's just, but in his mind is really the question here. Well, this is an analysis of his mind as a person who believes in authority and whatnot. So in his mind, both are unjust and just at the same time. And he says, and then I said, right, what if that society said it said? Who said that they can't impose on another society? If that society, the other society said that they can't, if that one society declares that it's just for them to impose on the other society, what standard do you have to say that it's not? But it's the basic standard that he does underneath it all recognizes you cannot impose on another. That is what injustice is. And so he says that's where fun stuff like wars come into play to settle such disputes. And again, it's like that's an irrelevant comment. That doesn't have anything to do with the logic of whether or not and which one is just. And that, so, but it does in his mind, because his belief is that might makes right. So whoever settles the dispute is in the right, according to him. And then so I say, and so if the society who wished to enslave the other one wins, they are justified because they won? ? And he says, who's to say they are not? Nobody can stop them, obviously. And now this directly contradicts what he just said several comments ago about one society cannot impose its laws on another. But then he says, well, who's to say they aren't justified in doing so if they said that they could? Well, you basically just said that they weren't justified in doing so. And my reply, though, was sanity. Sanity is to say that they aren't, because, one, you just contradicted yourself. And two, as I say here, your position is that so your own enslavement is justified if you fail to defend yourself successfully. And I say there is no purpose for the word justice within the position you have put forth. You can just call it whatever has happened. And his reply to all that is that my position, where did that go? My position is that society chooses its own laws based on cultural morality. And I said, but do their laws alter morality or justice? That is the question. And that is the question. That's the whole debate. But he keeps throwing out these irrelevant comments that have no bearing on the logic. Okay, I can agree. I don't necessarily agree with how you put it, but yeah, okay, society, quote, chooses its laws based on cultural morality. Yeah, but does that make them justified? Do you think that because the society said something is justified, does that make it so? Can the law make slavery justified? There are only two answers, and I say one makes you an anarchist, the other makes you insane. Because you have to accept the fact that your own enslavement would be justified if society said so. Or you contradict yourself. You say it only applies to everybody except for you. And he says that's a false dichotomy, and it's not. It isn't. And he says an opinion on one subject, aside from should government exist, does not make one an anarchist. And I agree with that. But ultimately here the thing is that government is the belief that law can make slavery just, that slavery is justified. That is the belief in government. So yes, if you don't believe this, you might not understand it all, but you are in essence an anarchist, because that is what government is, the belief that slavery is justified. And he says justice is subjective, and I said, be that as it may, does what you think is justice change with what the law says? And his reply, because he has to deflect and put another irrelevant comment out there, is, my opinion on what is just does not change the fact of law. I don't know what he means by the fact of law. Sure, his opinion doesn't change that there are people who call their commands law and that they believe that they alter justice. And he also believes that they alter justice, as he has said. He says, if I reach a point where a law is intolerable, I have the option of moving to society where it is not. And this opens up the gate to the next part of the conversation, in which we'll get to here in a second. He says, and I say, as opposed to defending yourself from unjust laws being enforced on you. Of course, according to the position that law alters justice, all laws are justified. So, And he says, society justifies law by abiding it. And my reply is, no, they don't. That's the same basic argument. And he says, once a law becomes intolerable, society changes it, ergo justice. And he's backwards. He's backwards. If might makes right, okay, and we understand what the word right and the word justice means, if society alters justice and if might makes right, then once a law becomes law through force and so on, and society declaring it to be law, then it is inherently justified, which then implies that it's supposed to be obeyed. Justice is a should claim, right? It's you're supposed to do this. This is what is just. Now, it might not be a negative, it might not be a call to action or a call to some obligation. It usually isn't in actual, if you want to make sense, it's not necessarily a call to action unless we're talking things like restitution or contract disputes, but it's usually a negative claim that, it's a claim that you should not be stopped from doing something. That's what right means. And justice means that which should not be infringed on and, things like that. Justice means this is what should happen, and that's basically what rights mean. And so, but to say that might makes right is to say, since that's what the word right means, is that once a tyrant attains power successfully, or a slaver successfully enslaves you, that they should not be stopped from doing so because you have said it is now rightful. And so if you say that might makes right, a slave who is successfully enslaved, that your statement implies that they should obey the master. So they should not defend against themselves. But he contradicts himself in his whole idea because he knows in the back of his mind that slavery is illegitimate and that there's no way that a person could have the right to rule another. So in order to get to overlook that, in order to ignore that, his actual underlying belief, he just takes it as a given that someone would depose the illegitimate tyrant. But the problem with that whole thing is, here, let me see if I can get to that part down here so that it makes more sense how I'm about to articulate this. Because I got straight to it, and I asked him, see, where's it? Okay, there it is. Let's say I take over Iraq. No matter how right I think I am, society is ultimately more right than I am if they depose me. Okay, but his problem is he has already started with might makes right. So if he is in power, he is in the right, which then implies that he should not be stopped. And then I ask him that. So then they only have the right to depose you if they depose you. And he says pretty much, if I can defend my office, then society hasn't reached a point where they are willing to do what it takes to bring me down. And I mean, that's just a totally insane comment because they might have made the attempt to bring you down, but lost. And according to his belief, he is saying that basically they're rightful in trying to depose him, even though he is rightful in being a despot because he has successfully done so and might makes right. It's completely schizophrenic and makes no sense because of what the word right means. Right means he should not be deposed. If he is saying he has the right to be a despot because might makes right and he has successfully become the despot, which is what he is saying, then he is contradicting himself if he says that the person has the right to try to depose him. Or that but he's saying if they do depose him, then they have the right to do it. But the problem with his belief is the words that he has used has basically implied that they don't have the right to try to depose him because he has the right to be the tyrant, because he has successfully done so. So it makes zero sense, and that was my next comment. That makes zero sense. If they try to depose you before they do so, then they are acting outside of their rights according to you. And he says reality makes zero sense to you, and it's like, no, you're actually the one who's suffering from a delusion. Of course, I know it's the exact opposite. It always goes this way. He thinks that I'm hallucinating, but I know I'm not the one in the cult, or at least I'm 99.999% sure I'm not the one in the cult here. I'm not the one who's saying that basically my own slavery could be justified if I happen to get enslaved and I can't defend myself. But his position leaves no room for a slave to defend himself because by definition, he is saying that the person who attempts to escape the slaver is violating the slaver's right of might to rule him that he has successfully created by doing so. And so, but then so we can't even get to the point logically that after the fact he has the right to do so, because he should not have even attempted to depose the tyrant, since the tyrant has the right to rule. And I mean, that's what that word means. If he's saying he has the right to do something, that is saying that he should not be stopped from doing it. That is what the word right means. So, I mean, that's the rundown of the insanely schizophrenic belief of might makes right, or that law alters morality. It's all basically the same thing. And then I said, do you know what the word right means? And I asked, you have the right to depose a slave master before you successfully do so, true or false? Which is the same in a different way of asking, so they only have the right to depose you if they depose you. And I don't think he answered that. He said, society deems what is considered just, which we've already established he believes that. But but to him, that's the question that I'm trying to ask, is do you think that justice alters with what society calls justice? And he does, because he says, if society decides a ruler is not just, society is within their rights to oppose it. But no, that directly contradicts the whole entire concept of might makes right. And it also contradicts his answer of pretty much to the question of, so they only have the right to depose you if they depose you. Versus if society decided that a ruler is not just, then society is within their rights to oppose it. No, they're not. They're only within their rights to oppose it if they do so, if they depose it. Like you should not oppose the guy who has the right to rule you. That's just not, and that's his position though. Let me clarify that, because I don't believe anyone has the right to rule anyone. But that's what these words mean. If you say that the tyrant has the right to rule because he has successfully done so, which, yes, that is what you are saying when you say might makes right. You say might makes right. He has successfully implemented might. Therefore, it is now his right to be the despot. The word right implies that he should not be stopped. Therefore, you are saying that the despot should not be stopped. But if they do stop him, then they have the right to do so. That makes zero sense. It's completely backward. The people have the right to depose the despot because the despot is slavery. The despot has enslaved them and slavery is unjustified and everyone has the right to be free. That is the same position as opposed to slavery is justified if they do it, which is basically the belief in might makes right. Slavery is a right if they successfully do it. But then that leaves no room for you to defend yourself, because if you are defending yourself, you are going against their right according to your own belief. Okay? So that makes no sense. It's completely insane. It's completely schizophrenic. It amounts to saying slavery is justified. So, yeah, the end. Completely insane. But that's my analysis on that. And, if you ask these questions, I'm sure you'll get generally the same responses, since this is a massive delusion that pretty much everybody shares the same fundamental beliefs of. I mean, obviously, maybe this would be more prone to a leftist or a heavily indoctrinated so-called right-winger who worships the police and the military and stuff. But more libertarian people, this might go a little bit different. If they still believe in government, they're obviously going to contradict themselves somewhere, but maybe not so blatantly as this person. Of course, he does not understand how he's, I mean, technically, I guess there really isn't a contradiction if you're just saying that